Hello friends, this is Jean Ross with Amazing Facts. You know, in the early 1900s, there was great interest in exploration. In particular, at the time, people wanted to go to the South Pole. Well, Robert Scott, a famous explorer in England, wanted to be the first to actually get to the South Pole and plant the flag of England there on that spot. So he organized an exploration team. And they gathered their supplies and they boarded a ship and sailed down to the South Antarctic. Well, they arrived and they began their long journey towards the South Pole. It was a difficult journey. Now, Robert Scott did not adequately prepare for what he was to face. You see, he got big Siberian ponies and he wanted them to pull the heavy sleds filled with their supplies across the snow and the ice. But after reaching the Arctic, they quickly discovered that these ponies were useless in the deep snow. They were unable to pull the sleds because their legs just slipped down and they couldn't get traction on the ice. Finally, they had to set the ponies aside, and some of Scott's men had to pull these sleds with all their supplies to try and make it to their destination. Well, after struggling for 14 days, they finally reached the pole. But how disappointing. There, flapping in the wind, was the flag of Norway. You see, a gentleman by the name of Ronald Amundsen of Norway had reached the pole just a few days before Robert Scott. Robert Scott was so disappointed. He wrote in his diary these words, "This is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored for it without reward. Well, we've gotten here. Now for the terrible struggle back home." Well, as Robert Scott and his men journeyed back, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees and the wind blew so strongly. Because of the cold and the wind, two of the men of Scott's party died. Robert Scott and two others pressed on, but to no avail. 8 months later, a search party found their frozen bodies in the snow. Unfortunately, Robert Scott did not prepare adequately for what he was to face. Whereas Ronald Amundsen of Norway, he did prepare. Ronald Amundsen safely navigated the perils of going to the South Pole and then returning back to Norway without losing a man, without even losing one of his sled dogs. You see, before heading off on his journey, Ronald Amundsen went to the northern regions of Norway and he studied how the people lived. He looked at the clothes that they wore. He realized quite quickly that in order to be successful in the snow and the ice, you needed to have light sleds. You couldn't use ponies, but you could use sled dogs. So after preparing adequately, Ronald set off on his journey. He successfully made it to the pole and then back home. Now, the reason I share this story is because in the Bible, we find Bible characters who were not adequately prepared for the trials that they were to face. I think of Simon Peter. Simon Peter was a person of strength. Whenever the names of the disciples are listed, Peter's name always comes up first. He had strength of leadership. He was one of the inner circle of disciples that got to share some very special experiences with Jesus. It was Peter, James, and John that Jesus set apart from the other disciples and took into an upper room, into a room where a little girl, 12 years of age, lay dead. They witnessed Jesus resurrect the little girl to life. It was also Peter, James, and John that Jesus brought with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. And there they witnessed Jesus glorified and Moses and Elijah appearing there with Christ. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus separated Peter, James, and John from the rest of the disciples, and he asked them to pray in a special way as he was facing that bitter cup, that terrible ordeal that he was to face for man's salvation. Peter was also a person of strength. He was the spokesman of the group. On one occasion, Jesus asked the disciples, he said, "Who do people say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Often it was Peter that would talk first. On the Mount of Transfiguration, it was Peter that said, "Lord, it's good for us to be here, for now we will build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." The Bible says there was a cloud that overshadowed him, and a voice was heard from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Peter was also the one that in a terrible storm there on the Sea of Galilee, Peter, looking through the storm, saw Jesus walking on the water. And Peter said, "Lord, if it is you, bid me to come walking to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and he walked on water as long as he kept looking to Jesus. But when Peter took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. And he lifted up his hand and cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus was there to lift him up. Yes, Peter was a person that had both strengths and weaknesses. He had physical strength. He was a fisherman. He was used to pulling in nets and rowing boats. Yet, despite all of these good qualities, we find Peter denying Jesus while keeping warm at the enemy's fire. You see, Peter's problem was that he wasn't aware of his weaknesses. Peter was confident in his own abilities. On one occasion, Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." But when it really mattered, Peter denied his Lord. So it is, friends, in our lives. We need to recognize that we're not always prepared for the trials that'll come our way. Our confidence cannot be in our own ability and our own strength. Rather, it needs to be centered in Jesus. On one occasion, when Jesus was surrounded by his enemies, the Roman soldiers came to arrest Jesus. Peter pulled the sword out, and he was willing to take on the whole Roman army, and he swung his sword and he chopped off the high priest's servant's ear, and Jesus performed a miracle and healed it. But Jesus said, "Peter, put away your sword." You see, Peter was strong when all of his friends were around him, but he was weak when he was alone. For the Christian, we need to recognize that it's one thing to be a Christian when all of our friends are with us, but still to be a Christian when we are alone. To not be conformed to the crowd, to not be pressed into what is popular and what people are doing around us. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to be a youth pastor at a youth camp. And there were different activities that the young people would be involved in. One of the things that they liked to do was to make clay molds of different things. And on one occasion, I walked down to where they were busy working, and they had a large open area of clay that was in a watery type condition, and they had a whole lot of plastic molds. And they would take the clay and they'd pour it into the mold, whether it's a horse or a dog or whatever it is they were making. They would pour the clay into the mold, and then they would let the mold sit, and they would wait for the clay to harden. Now, often the way young people are, they will pour the clay into a mold and they'll set it aside, but then they will change their mind and they'll say, "Well, no, I don't want that anymore. I want to have something else." Well, depending upon how long the clay is in the mold, if it's been in there not too long, you were able to peel back the plastic, and even though the clay was beginning to set, you could break it down and add some water and mix it up, and it would become fluid-like, and then you could pour it into a different mold. But after leaving the clay in the mold for a certain amount of time, it was impossible to break it back down into that watery consistency. It got lumpy and hard. No matter how much you tried, you couldn't use it again. You know, and when I think of that experience, I think of the Christian. Here we are in a world that is trying to squeeze us into its mold. But God is telling us to be molded not according to the things of this world, but to be molded according to the things of heaven. For this world is not our home. We're just passing through. Our real home is in heaven. And we want to be careful that we don't allow those around us or our environment to try and squeeze us into the mold of the earth, and we lose our true objective, our true goal. Well, in the story of Peter had to learn this lesson the hard way. Thereafter, denying Jesus while sitting around that enemy fire, after the rooster crowed, Peter looked at Jesus, and Jesus looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the words that Jesus had said, that he would deny him. Suddenly, Peter realized what he had done, and he got up from that spot and he ran back to that garden where Jesus, just a short time before, had prayed and perspired drops of blood, and Peter fell upon the ground and he prayed, and God forgave him. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared with the disciples there by the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus asked Peter a question. Jesus said, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" You see, Jesus, earlier, after he had told the disciples that somebody would betray him, Peter had said to Jesus, "Well, Lord, even if they all leave you, I will never leave you." And so Jesus said, "Peter, do you really love me more than these?" And of course, Peter realized what Jesus was talking about, that he had denied his Lord. And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And again, Jesus asked the question, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And again, Peter responded and said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And a third time, Jesus asked the same question. You see, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And 3 times Jesus asked the question, "Peter, do you love me?" Well, friends, we want to be able to answer that question because Jesus is asking each of us that same question. Christian, do you love me? Are you prepared for what is yet to come? Are you trusting in me, allowing my Spirit to mold your heart and life, or are you allowing yourself to be molded by the things around us? Every one of us will have our faith tested, and we want to be able to stand true to Jesus at that time of trial, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there in the fiery furnace that stood true for their God, irrespective of the consequences. Well, friends, I want to encourage you that whatever situation you might be facing today, don't allow the world to push you into its mold, but through the renewing of your mind, through spending time in communion with Jesus through prayer, allow His Spirit to mold you and shape you into the kind of person that God wants you to be. May God give you grace and strength that you might stand for Him, whatever the circumstance might be.